Hello, welcome to another episode of our Humanitarian Affairs podcast. And I wouldn't want to continue this particular conversation if I do not talk about the people who are actually in the humanitarian space, the people who actually are responsible for providing aid and assistance to majority communities, vulnerable people in Africa who are always affected by disasters, conflicts, climate shocks, and other forms of emergencies across Africa. And for that particular reason, I have a particular interest on understanding why are NGOs, why are humanitarian organizations laying off their workers, their employees in 2025 and in 2026, especially in 2026. This is basically the conversation that we are going to have in this particular episode. For us to understand why are NGOs, why are humanitarian organizations letting go of their employees, their staff members, we need to understand, first of all, what is an NGO and how exactly does it work and why does it work? Why does it do what it does? And to start us off, it's important to understand that an NGO basically would mean it's a non-governmental organization. So it just means it operates more like government because it gives services to communities, to members of the society, services that will, on ordinary circumstances, be given by the government. If you understand the social contract theory in law, where the origin of government is because people come together to say that there are things we can provide for ourselves, but there are things that we cannot provide for ourselves. So we need to come together, give up some of our rights, and give these particular, for example, taxes to a particular entity called a government so that they can provide to us like security, safety, water, infrastructure, and all of that. So in some cases where government is not able to, for one reason or the other, in Africa, corruption is the main reason, poor leadership is the main reason why governments are not able to provide services to their own people. Then non-governmental organizations like NGOs always comes through. And so they provide the same services, for example, health services. Some of them actually provide food. Some of them would actually provide education and even empower communities to demand better from their own governments through advocacy and policy strengthening processes. So that is basically what an NGO is. You will see a lot of NGOs across Africa, and some of them are known globally. For example, the International Federation of the Red Cross operating as national societies of Red Cross and Red Crescent in different countries. AMREF Health Africa also operating in different countries within Africa. You also have some entities like World Vision. We also have Concern Worldwide, Oxfam. These are all NGOs and international NGOs that are working within African content, and many others that I might not be able to mention in this context. Now, there's been an interesting trend where they are now letting go their staff, reducing the sizes of the operations, and some of them are actually withdrawing even from operations within this particular context in Africa. And it's important to understand then, how do they work and where did this problem start? So, for us to understand how NGOs work and where they get their funding, I have spent over 12 years working in the NGO sector, and I've actually participated in processes of trying to get funding for institutions successfully on many occasions. And one of the things that usually happens is it's important that an NGO understands its scope of work. For example, the NGOs that work specifically in the climate space, others would work during emergency response or in disaster situations. So once you understand, for example, an organization that works in the disaster space, and providing humanitarian relief during emergencies, then they would actually reach out to potential donors and funders to give them money to be able to reach the communities that are affected. So that process is actually called proposal writing. Yeah, or some of them would actually issue, for example, calls for funding, like disaster relief funds across different countries, across different spaces. Some of them will actually receive funding from their sister organizations in the West, or even in Europe, or even within the United States of America. And so once they get this funding, they would actually now employ people to go and provide relief to the people that are affected, the vulnerable in the community. So the people they employ are actually the ones we call NGO staff members, or NGO employees, or humanitarian aid workers. Some of them are employed full-time, some of them are actually on part-time. Some of them usually have short-term contracts, which is a very common trend within the NGO space. So the question then comes in, Why exactly then will they let them go? Well, we know that for a fact humanitarian crises are increasing. There are more conflicts that need humanitarian assistance. There are actually climate shocks, the situations that are happening across Africa. The Horn of Africa is actually worse affected, worse hit as we speak. And we also have other situations. For example, we have other emergencies like the flood in Mozambique that is actually causing a lot of instability in that particular space. So why is it that then we are seeing that NGOs are actually pulling away their staff, maybe letting them go? At the same time, we know for a fact that people need this particular help, and the need for humanitarian assistance has never been this much higher in history than today. So we trace back to where this started, and your guess is as good as mine. So in 2025 January, there was a swearing in of a new president in the United States called President Donald Trump. Donald Trump actually, among the things that he was prioritizing, he actually felt that there was a lot of waste and a lot of wastage of American dollar, the American taxpayers' money, in things that he called no, not to the national interest of Americans themselves. So he embarked on certain processes, certain things that he decided to undertake. For example, the first thing he did actually, President Donald Trump expressed his interest to withdraw from the WHO, the World Health Organization. Now, most of you will understand the role that the World Health Organization undertakes across Africa in supporting humanitarian work, especially in the health space, strengthening health systems across Africa, providing more capacity, more trainings to health workers, and even supplies, especially medical supplies in different countries. Remember the role they had during the COVID-19 pandemic? Yes. That's actually one of the things that Donald Trump had a problem with. And so he expressed his interest to withdraw from it. You will note that 80% of WHO's fund actually came from either the United States as a government or either of its agencies that operate in that particular context. So this actually is one of the reasons why WHO then had less funding. In January this year, 2026, they actually finished the process of withdrawing from WHO. The second thing that Donald Trump actually undertook, he started saying that he preferred bilateral agreements with countries. So instead of giving money to an NGO, he would rather give money for aid and assistance to a government directly and expect the government to be accountable to the United States government directly and not through what he called third parties who are expressing wastage. So the interesting thing again about this is that earlier this year, if you are following, Kenya actually got money from the United States, about 1.6 billion, that is meant to go to the health space, supporting, tuberculosis, malaria, child health, maternal child health, and many other areas. Uganda was the second country that also went and got its package from the United States, 1.7 billion, which is around 0.1 billion more than the Kenyan government got. And they were also given that money directly, not through an NGO, not through an international non-governmental organization. And so this money was given to these governments directly. Well, in Kenya, you'll note that there's actually a court case that has actually a petition that has stopped the implementation of that contract between Kenya and the United States of government on data protection issues. We had a lot of we're always in courts, and we always need to make sure that we're doing things right. But yes, so money came to Kenya, and so then that means traditional organizations that would actually receive this money to implement will not get them because it's actually directly to the Kenyan government. The other interesting thing, for example, is what our very amazing president, Donald Trump, did. He actually decided to punish governments in Africa that he considered to be misbehaving with humanitarian aid and assistance. For example, Somalia government earlier in the year was accused of having confiscated food from the WFP, that is the World Food Program. So they actually took food from that was meant for distribution to communities for whatever reasons. So what did Donald Trump do? He actually issued an order, the US government issued an order to stop any aid and assistance to Somalia until that food was returned and until accountability was taken by the government. The Somali government actually took responsibility for that, and for that particular reason, through a statement from White House, they have now restored aid to Somalia. Same thing happened in South Sudan, where it's accused of having taken humanitarian vehicles that are used to provide aid, and the same scenario happened, just stopped aid to South Sudan and basically the South Sudanese government then, of course, now had to start conversations directly with them. And the last bit that actually Donald Trump did, one of the main decisions that he undertook, of course, as the United States government, he recently expressed interest to withdraw from 66 organizations and agencies, about 31 to 33 of them that are considered to be directly United Nations. Now, some of these organizations are actually the ones that provide funding to NGOs in Africa to provide contracts to the employees to actually help their communities. You see that chain? So basically what he did, he actually expressed interest to withdraw. For example, UN Women, he actually expressed interest to withdraw from that. The UNFPA, that is United Nations Population Fund, he actually said he's going to withdraw from that. The UNESCO, the one that we know for science, education, and culture, he also said he's going to withdraw from that. UN Water, UN Energy, and many others, 31 of them. By the way, one interesting one, he actually withdrew from a UN agency that's supposed to support children in armed conflict situation. Yeah, he actually withdrew from that as well. And so the effect of this is that, remember, UN is here, then organizations, NGOs are here, and then the communities that are assisted are here. Where are our NGO workers? Here. And so again, this also means that there's less funding coming to these particular communities, meaning there's less funding coming to NGOs. So it means the proposals that I used to write back in the days will ordinarily not get as much funding as we expected. You will tell me, this is just for US. This is not why, I mean, they will still get money from Europe. Here is the shocker. In the recent meeting, that is the NATO meeting, the North Atlantic Trade Organization's meeting, where they actually agree, United States is actually a member of the NATO and other European countries, they actually agreed that they need to put their budget for military support to be up to 5%. Now, most countries had actually not hit 5% of their national budget dedicated to military support and defense of their own countries. So, of course, Donald Trump asked them, you need to make sure that that money, you hit the 5% national budget. So if you are European countries, and you want to cut and make sure that you hit the 5% of your budget, where do you remove that money from? They went to the international assistance pocket, where the money they usually keep to support countries like in Africa and South America and Asia, that's where they took some of the money to try and hit the 5% target that they have been given. They also cut, by the way, some services to their own local citizens. So then that means, again, money from EU to African countries is also going to reduce significantly in the coming years. And so because of that, again, proposals are not funded by NGOs. You get that? So then that means this is how then the non-governmental organizations in Africa started reducing the numbers of employees. When you're an NGO and you're told there is less funding coming this particular year, so what do? You introduce things that we call restructuring, for example, of your own operations, or you review different positions and contracts and see how they've been working, or sometimes you just decide to say, okay, I have 50 employees, I need to cut that by 50% to 25. And so among the people who are affected are especially technical people, field officers, and project officers in most cases. And some functions are usually merged within these organizations. So as we speak right now, if you know someone who works for an NGO in any part of this continent, in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Cameroon, in Burkina Faso, you need to reach out to find out exactly what is their status and if there's any support that they could use. I personally have been in the NGO space, and I remember staying out of it for 1 year out of my own reasons. And that period is one area that you need a lot of support from your friends, from your relatives, from your colleagues. And if you're actually an NGO staff who has actually been let go, I'll tell you from my own personal experience of having resigned from an NGO before, it might look like it's the end of the world for you, but actually it could just be the beginning of a new space, of a new encounter in the world for you. Take a look at your own expertise, take a look at your own experiences, take a look at your own, what can you offer? If you can do consultancies, a lot of us have a lot of experience that we can actually be used even in the academic space. It's important that you look at that. If you can take this opportunity to actually advance your career and maybe pivot a little bit. For example, you are skill was basically used within one NGO and it's not easy to sell it into another space or in the corporate world, this is the time for you to pivot and look at what exactly can you do. By the way, I ended up being an English Swahili translator for some organization, and that actually kept me afloat for some time. And that is something that I continue to do, so it's important that you also pivot during this particular time. All is not lost. Things are going to get better one way or the other. It's not the end of it all. Reach out, create a community, and let's help each other out of this difficult time, because that setback could be a setup for a comeback.